This showroom is for serious buyers. The woman smiled as she said it, and several people nearby laughed. 10 minutes later, not one of them could look the single father in the eye. The afternoon sun poured through the massive glass windows of Sinclair Luxury Motors, casting bright reflections across polished floors and rows of gleaming vehicles worth more than most people earned in a year. Everything inside the dealership felt expensive. The scent of fresh leather filled the air. Soft music played through hidden speakers. Sales associates moved confidently between customers dressed in tailored suits and designer clothing. Then the front door opened. Daniel Brooks stepped inside, holding his daughter Emma's hand. His work boots carried traces of dust from a long morning job. His faded blue work shirt showed signs of honest labor. A few streaks of paint remained on one sleeve. Nothing about him matched the image most people expected to see in a luxury dealership. Emma, however, walked proudly beside him. Her blonde hair was tied back neatly, and her smile lit up the room in a way no luxury vehicle ever could. "Wow," she whispered. "Dad, look at that one." Daniel smiled as she pointed toward a silver SUV displayed beneath bright showroom lights. "Pretty nice, huh?" Emma nodded enthusiastically. "It looks like something from a movie." Daniel laughed softly. "Maybe." They slowly walked between the vehicles. Emma stopped every few feet to admire another car. Daniel never seemed rushed. He simply enjoyed watching his daughter experience something new. Across the showroom, Victoria Sinclair stood speaking with regional managers near the customer lounge. At 38, she had built one of the most successful automotive retail groups in the state. Her confidence filled every room she entered. Employees respected her. Investors admired her. Customers often recognized her from business magazines and television interviews. She noticed Daniel almost immediately. At first, she paid little attention. Then she saw him examining one of the highest-priced vehicles on the floor. One manager leaned closer and quietly said something. Victoria glanced toward Daniel again. A faint smile appeared. "Let me guess," she said. "Browsing." The manager chuckled. "Probably." Victoria walked toward them. Several employees followed. Emma was studying the interior of a luxury SUV when Victoria approached. "Beautiful vehicle, isn't it?" she asked. Emma turned and smiled. "It is amazing." Victoria nodded politely before looking toward Daniel. Her eyes moved from his work boots to his worn shirt. Then she smiled again. "Just so you know," she said, loud enough for nearby customers to hear, "this showroom is for serious buyers." A few people laughed. Emma's smile disappeared immediately. Daniel remained calm. "Good to know," he replied. Victoria folded her arms. "We get a lot of people who come in just to look around." More quiet laughter followed. Emma lowered her eyes. Daniel noticed. He gently squeezed her hand. "It is okay." Victoria seemed satisfied and turned slightly toward the employees. "Make sure our actual appointments are taken care of first." Several customers nearby smiled awkwardly. Others looked away. Nobody challenged the comment. Nobody stepped in. The moment lingered in the air like an unpleasant echo. Yet Daniel never reacted with anger. He never raised his voice. He never tried to defend himself. Instead, he looked down at Emma. "Still want to see the SUV?" The little girl nodded slowly. "Yeah. Then let us look." They continued walking through the showroom as if nothing had happened. Victoria watched them for a moment before returning to her managers. "People waste so much time pretending," she said. One manager laughed politely. Another forced a smile. Across the showroom floor, Emma remained unusually quiet. Daniel eventually noticed. "What is wrong?" She hesitated. "Nothing." "Emma." She sighed softly. "Why do people always think they know everything about somebody?" Daniel smiled gently. Sunlight reflected across the polished floor between them. Luxury vehicles stood silently around them like sculptures. "Because appearances are easy," he said. "Character takes longer to see." Emma thought about that. Then she nodded. A few moments later, the receptionist's phone rang near the front desk. She answered. Her expression changed immediately. Then she looked across the showroom directly at Daniel Brooks. And suddenly, the atmosphere inside Sinclair Luxury Motors began to change. The receptionist lowered the phone slowly, her expression shifting from routine professionalism to visible surprise. For a moment, she simply stared across the showroom at Daniel Brooks. Several employees noticed immediately. Victoria Sinclair noticed too. The dealership had grown quiet in that strange way large spaces do when something unexpected interrupts the normal rhythm of the day. The receptionist cleared her throat. Mr. Brooks? Daniel looked up from the SUV he and Emma had been examining. Yes. There is a call for you. Daniel appeared mildly surprised. For me? Yes, sir. Emma glanced at her father. Do you know who it is? Daniel smiled. No idea. He walked calmly toward the reception desk, while curious eyes followed him across the polished floor. Victoria folded her arms and watched from a distance. The receptionist handed him the phone. They said it is important. Daniel thanked her and placed the receiver to his ear. This is Daniel. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. Nobody could hear the voice on the other end. Yet everyone could see Daniel's expression. It never changed. Calm, respectful, humble. When the call ended, he thanked the caller, returned the phone, and smiled politely. Have a good day. Then he simply walked back toward Emma. Victoria frowned slightly. She expected some kind of explanation, some dramatic reaction. Instead, Daniel acted as though nothing unusual had happened. Emma looked up at him. Everything okay? Yep. Who was it? Just somebody checking in. The little girl smiled and accepted the answer. Children often trusted the people they loved completely. Victoria continued watching them. Something about Daniel bothered her now, though she could not explain why. Most people reacted when they were embarrassed. Most people tried to prove themselves. Most people argued. Daniel had done none of those things. He simply remained steady. Meanwhile, Emma climbed into the passenger seat of the display SUV and grinned. Dad, this one has heated seats. Daniel laughed softly. Pretty fancy. And look, she pointed excitedly at the dashboard. It even has screens in the back. Daniel leaned closer. That would have impressed me when I was 10. Emma smiled. It impresses me now. For a moment, the unpleasant encounter seemed forgotten. Father and daughter simply enjoyed spending time together. Across the showroom, Victoria's regional manager approached quietly. Do you know who that guy is? He asked. A customer, Victoria replied. Maybe. The manager glanced toward Daniel. The call came from the Children's Heart Foundation. Victoria looked at him. What? The receptionist overheard part of it. He lowered his voice. Apparently, they were thanking him. Victoria frowned. For what? The manager shrugged. No idea. The answer lingered in her mind longer than she expected. A few minutes later, another employee approached Daniel carrying paperwork. Mr. Brooks? Daniel turned. Yes. I wanted to thank you. Daniel looked confused. For what? The employee smiled. My nephew received treatment through the Children's Heart Foundation last year. Daniel remained silent. The young man continued. I recognized your name when the call came through. Victoria's attention sharpened immediately. Several nearby customers began listening too. I just wanted to shake your hand, the employee said. People like you make things possible. Daniel looked uncomfortable. A lot of people help. Maybe, the employee replied. But not many help the way you do. Daniel smiled politely, but said nothing more. Emma looked up at her father. Dad, he already knew the question. Later, the little girl nodded. Victoria watched the exchange carefully. Her confidence began slipping, replaced by curiosity. She had formed a complete opinion about Daniel within seconds of seeing him. Now small cracks were appearing in that judgment. Outside, sunlight reflected across rows of luxury vehicles parked on the lot. Inside, the atmosphere continued changing. Not dramatically, quietly, like a tide slowly shifting direction. Emma eventually climbed out of the SUV and walked beside her father again. Can I ask you something? She said. Always. Why did you never tell people about the foundation? Daniel looked down at her. Because helping somebody is not supposed to be advertising. The answer was simple, yet it seemed to stop the room for a second. Even Victoria heard it. Even Victoria felt it. And for the first time that afternoon, she began wondering whether the man she had dismissed so easily might be someone very different from the person she imagined. Victoria Sinclair spent her life believing she could read people within seconds. It was one of the skills that helped build her company. Confidence, presentation, discipline. Success often left clues, and over the years she had trained herself to notice them immediately. Yet as she watched Daniel Brooks walking through the showroom with his daughter, a strange feeling settled in her chest. Not guilt. Not yet. Doubt. The kind that appears when a first impression begins to crack. Daniel and Emma had moved toward another section of the dealership where family vehicles were displayed beneath large banners and bright lighting. Emma seemed excited again. The brief embarrassment from earlier had faded, replaced by curiosity. Daniel listened patiently as she pointed out features she liked. Heated seats, extra storage space, large windows, third-row seating, things that mattered to a 10-year-old imagining adventures. Victoria found herself watching them longer than she intended. Nearby, customers continued discussing luxury packages and financing options. Yet the father and daughter seemed completely unaffected by the atmosphere surrounding them. There was something peaceful about the way they interacted, something genuine. Meanwhile, Emma tugged gently on her father's sleeve. "Dad, yeah. Can I ask you something?" Daniel smiled. "Always." She hesitated. "Did what that lady said bother you?" Daniel already knew who she meant. He looked through the showroom windows where sunlight reflected off rows of parked vehicles outside. "A little." Emma lowered her eyes. "Me too." Daniel knelt beside her. "You know something?" She nodded. "What?" "People sometimes say things based on what they think they see." Emma listened carefully. "That does not mean they are right." The little girl thought about it for a moment. Then she smiled faintly. "Grandpa used to say that." Daniel laughed softly. "All the time." Hearing him mention his father always brought a certain warmth to his voice. Emma noticed it immediately. "You miss him?" "Every day." She slipped her small hand into his. "I think he would be proud of you." Daniel looked away briefly. Not because he disagreed. Because those words always carried weight. Across the showroom, Victoria overheard part of the conversation. She had not intended to listen. Yet somehow she found herself unable to ignore them. Something about Daniel's calmness felt unusual. Most people in his position would have reacted differently. They would have defended themselves, complained, tried to prove something. Daniel seemed interested only in protecting his daughter's feelings. A few minutes later, the dealership manager hurried across the showroom carrying a tablet. His expression looked unusually serious. "Miss Sinclair." Victoria turned. "What is it?" "There is something you should probably see." He handed her the tablet. Victoria glanced at the screen. At first she appeared confused. Then her eyes widened slightly. Several lines of information filled the display. Donation records, foundation board acknowledgments, community service awards, anonymous charitable contributions. One name appeared repeatedly. Daniel Brooks. Victoria looked up. "Are these verified?" The manager nodded immediately. "Every one of them." She continued scrolling. The amounts surprised her. Not because they were enormous. Because they represented years of consistent generosity. Quiet generosity. The kind nobody publicized. The kind nobody used for recognition. The kind most people never noticed. Victoria slowly lowered the tablet. Across the room, Daniel was helping Emma compare two SUVs. He had no idea anyone was reviewing his history. No idea anyone was reevaluating him. No idea the assumptions made about him earlier were beginning to collapse. The manager cleared his throat. "There is more." Victoria looked up. "More?" He nodded. "A lot more." Before she could respond, another employee approached. "Mr. Brooks' appointment just arrived." Daniel looked surprised. "Already?" The employee smiled. "Right on time." Emma blinked. "Appointment?" Daniel smiled at her. "I told you we were not just looking." Her eyes widened. "Really? Really?" Excitement immediately replaced every trace of sadness. Victoria watched father and daughter walk toward a private consultation office near the rear of the dealership. The same consultation office reserved for premium clients. The same office she assumed Daniel would never enter. As the door closed behind them, the showroom atmosphere shifted again. Employees exchanged curious glances. Managers whispered quietly. And for the first time that afternoon, Victoria Sinclair began wondering whether the most expensive mistake in the building had nothing to do with cars at all. Inside the private consultation office, the atmosphere felt completely different from the showroom floor. Large windows overlooked rows of vehicles outside. A polished wooden table sat in the center of the room. Bottled water rested beside neatly organized folders. Emma looked around with wide eyes. "This place is nice." Daniel smiled. "It is." A senior sales consultant entered carrying paperwork and greeted them warmly. "Mr. Brooks, thank you for coming in." Daniel stood and shook his hand. "Good to see you again." Emma immediately noticed something. "You know each other?" The consultant laughed softly. "We have met before." Daniel nodded. "A few times." The man placed several documents on the table. "Everything is ready whenever you are." Meanwhile, outside the office, Victoria remained standing near the showroom entrance. The tablet was still in her hands. She reviewed the information again. Community projects, scholarship donations, medical assistance funds, volunteer programs. Year after year, the same name appeared. Not attached to publicity campaigns. Not attached to social media announcements. Simply attached to results. Victoria slowly looked toward the consultation office. "Who is he?" she asked quietly. The dealership manager answered immediately. "From what I can tell, he owns Brooks Electrical Services." Victoria nodded. "I know the company. Most people do." The manager hesitated. What most people do not know is that he started it alone after his wife passed away. Victoria looked up. His wife died 8 years ago. The manager lowered his voice. He raised Emma by himself while building the company. For the first time all afternoon, Victoria felt genuinely uncomfortable. She remembered the look on Emma's face when the laughter spread through the showroom. She remembered her own words. Suddenly, they sounded much worse in her memory than they had at the time. Across the dealership, customers continued browsing. Employees continued working. Yet Victoria could not stop thinking about the father and daughter inside that office. A few minutes later, Emma's laughter drifted through the partially open door. Victoria glanced over instinctively. She saw Daniel sitting beside his daughter reviewing vehicle options. There was no arrogance, no attempt to impress anyone, no desire for attention, just a father trying to make a good decision for his child. Inside the office, Emma pointed excitedly at one of the brochures. "This one has the safety package." Daniel smiled. "That is important. And it has room for road trips." "Also important." The consultant laughed. "You might be my youngest customer ever to focus on practical features." Emma grinned proudly. Daniel looked at her and smiled. Moments like this mattered to him. Not because of the vehicle, because of the memory. Life had not always been easy. There were years when every dollar mattered. Years when grief and responsibility arrived together. Years when simply moving forward felt like an accomplishment. Yet through all of it, he had tried to give Emma stability, kindness, and hope. Outside, Victoria found herself walking toward the office without fully deciding to do so. She stopped near the doorway and watched quietly. The scene before her did not match the assumptions she had made earlier. Not even close. Then another employee approached carrying additional documents. "Everything has been approved," he said. As expected, Victoria frowned. "Approved?" The employee looked surprised. "Yes." He glanced toward the office. "Mr. Brooks was pre-approved weeks ago." Victoria stared at him. "Weeks ago?" "Of course." The employee smiled. "One of the strongest applications we have seen this quarter." The words landed heavily. Not because Daniel needed financial validation, but because they exposed how completely wrong her judgment had been. She had looked at work boots and assumed limitations. She had seen a worn shirt and imagined failure. She had mistaken humility for lack of success. Inside the office, Emma smiled at her father. "Mom would have loved this day." Daniel paused briefly. Then he nodded. "Yeah." The answer was soft, honest, full of memory. Victoria heard it. And in that moment, the confident CEO who believed she understood people began realizing how much she still had to learn. When Daniel and Emma finally stepped out of the consultation office, the atmosphere inside the dealership felt noticeably different. Conversations softened. Employees who had barely noticed them earlier now greeted them with genuine respect. The change was subtle, but impossible to miss. Emma noticed it immediately. "Dad," she whispered, "everybody is acting different." Daniel smiled. "People are allowed to change their minds." The little girl looked around the showroom. "That was fast." Daniel laughed softly. "Sometimes life moves quickly." Nearby, Victoria Sinclair stood beside one of the display vehicles, watching father and daughter cross the showroom floor. For the first time in years, she felt uncertain about how to approach someone. Normally, she excelled in every social situation. Confidence had always been one of her strengths. Yet confidence felt strangely absent now. She had spent her career teaching managers not to judge customers by appearances. She had repeated that lesson in countless meetings. Somehow she had failed to follow it herself. Meanwhile, Emma continued asking questions about the vehicle they had selected. "Can we take road trips?" "Absolutely." "Can we visit the mountains?" "Absolutely." "Can we stop for ice cream?" Daniel smiled. "That might be the most important feature." Emma laughed. The sound filled the showroom with warmth. Several employees smiled without even realizing it. Across the room, Victoria overheard the exchange. It reminded her of something she had not thought about in years. Her own father. Long before business success, long before boardrooms and interviews. There had been simple afternoons filled with conversations just like that. Somewhere along the way, she realized she had become very good at measuring achievement and very bad at recognizing character. A dealership manager approached Daniel carrying another folder. "Everything is finalized." Daniel shook his hand. "Thank you. It was our pleasure." The manager hesitated briefly. "And thank you for everything you do for the community." Daniel immediately looked uncomfortable. "There are a lot of people helping." "Maybe," the manager replied, "but not many as quietly as you." Daniel smiled politely and changed the subject. As always, he seemed determined to keep attention away from himself. Victoria noticed that too. Most successful people she encountered enjoyed recognition. Daniel almost seemed to avoid it. A few moments later, an older woman entered the dealership. The receptionist greeted her warmly. The woman immediately spotted Daniel and smiled. "There you are." Daniel looked surprised. "Mrs. Keller." Emma brightened. "Hi." The woman hugged Emma gently before turning toward Daniel. "I heard you were here." Daniel laughed softly. "News travels fast." Mrs. Keller nodded. The foundation board meeting ended early. Victoria looked up immediately. "Foundation board." She listened carefully. Mrs. Keller smiled warmly. "We approved the new pediatric assistance program this morning." Daniel looked genuinely pleased. "That is wonderful. It only happened because of your donation." Daniel shook his head. "It happened because everyone worked together." Mrs. Keller laughed. "You always say that." Several people nearby had stopped pretending not to listen, Victoria included. The older woman continued. 3 more families will receive treatment support this year." Emma smiled proudly. "That is good." "It is very good," Mrs. Keller replied. Then she looked toward Daniel. "Your wife would be proud." Silence settled gently around them. Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment. "I hope so." The answer was quiet, honest, real. Victoria felt something tighten in her chest. She suddenly understood why Daniel gave so much of himself to causes involving children and families. Pain had shaped him. Loss had shaped him. Yet somehow neither had made him bitter. They had made him kinder. Mrs. Keller eventually left. The showroom slowly returned to normal. But the emotional weight of the conversation remained. Victoria stood motionless near the display vehicles. Every new detail revealed another layer she had completely failed to see. The hardworking father. The business owner. The community supporter. The widower. The man who quietly changed lives while expecting nothing in return. And with each passing minute, one realization became harder to ignore. Daniel Brooks was not becoming more impressive because people were discovering his accomplishments. He was becoming more impressive because he never used those accomplishments to define himself. As the afternoon moved closer to evening, Sinclair Luxury Motors felt different from the place it had been only an hour earlier. The bright showroom remained the same. The polished floors still reflected the rows of vehicles lined beneath elegant lighting. Yet the atmosphere had changed. Employees spoke more thoughtfully. Customers lingered longer. The story unfolding inside the dealership had quietly become more important than any vehicle on display. Daniel Brooks stood beside Emma, reviewing the final details of their purchase. The little girl could barely contain her excitement. Every few minutes, she asked another question about future road trips, favorite music playlists, or places they might visit together. Daniel answered each one with patience and a smile. Across the showroom, Victoria Sinclair watched them while holding a cup of coffee she had forgotten to drink. The more she learned about Daniel, the more uncomfortable she became with her own behavior. Not because he was successful, not because he could afford the vehicle. Those facts no longer seemed important. What bothered her was realizing how quickly she had dismissed a man whose character far exceeded anything she had assumed. A few moments later, another visitor entered the dealership. He was an older gentleman wearing a simple gray jacket and carrying a small folder. The receptionist immediately recognized him. "Mr. Chandler," she said warmly. The man smiled and looked around the showroom. His eyes quickly found Daniel. "There he is." Daniel looked surprised. "Robert." The two men shook hands. Emma smiled. "Hi, Mr. Chandler." "Hello, young lady." Victoria noticed the familiarity and quietly stepped closer. Robert Chandler turned toward one of the sales associates. "I hope I am not interrupting anything." Daniel laughed softly. "You usually are." Everyone nearby smiled. There was genuine affection in the exchange. Robert opened the folder he carried and handed Daniel several papers. The community center project is officially approved. Daniel looked pleased. That is great news. Robert nodded. 3 years of planning finally paid off. One customer nearby asked quietly, "Community center?" Robert smiled. "A youth education center." Then he pointed toward Daniel. "His idea." Daniel immediately shook his head. "It was everybody's idea." Robert laughed. "There he goes again." Victoria listened carefully. Robert continued. "For the last 3 years, he has been helping organize funding, volunteer programs, and construction planning." Daniel looked embarrassed by the attention. "A lot of people contributed." "Yes," Robert replied. "But most people did not spend hundreds of evenings helping after work." The showroom grew noticeably quieter. Victoria felt another piece of the puzzle fall into place. Every person who spoke about Daniel described the same qualities: service, humility, consistency, character. Not once had anyone praised him for wealth. Not once had anyone mentioned status. They respected him because of who he was. Emma looked proudly at her father. "You never told me that part." Daniel smiled. "There are lots of things I do not tell you." "Why?" she asked. "Because helping people is supposed to help people." Robert Chandler nodded approvingly. "That answer right there is why everybody trusts him." The words settled gently across the room. Even employees who had never met Daniel before seemed affected by them. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly. She remembered her own words from earlier in the day. "This showroom is for serious buyers." At the time, she thought she was protecting her business. Now the sentence sounded shallow. Embarrassing. She had measured seriousness by appearance. Yet the most serious person in the building had been standing in front of her the entire time. Daniel never seemed to notice the growing admiration around him. He remained focused on Emma, the paperwork, and making sure everything was in order. Outside, golden sunlight began washing across the dealership lot. Long shadows stretched beneath rows of vehicles. Inside, something even more significant was happening. The truth about Daniel Brooks was no longer emerging through a single revelation. It was emerging through dozens of small stories told by people whose lives he had quietly improved. And with every story, the silence surrounding Victoria Sinclair grew heavier, because she was beginning to understand that the greatest mistake she made that afternoon was not underestimating a customer. It was underestimating a man. The showroom had grown quieter as the afternoon light softened into shades of gold. Outside, the sun hung lower above the city skyline. Inside Sinclair Luxury Motors, the excitement surrounding vehicles and sales seemed secondary now. Most conversations had shifted toward something else entirely: character, reputation, the quiet impact one person could have on the lives of others. Daniel Brooks remained completely unaware of how many opinions had changed around him. He stood beside Emma reviewing a few final details while employees moved respectfully through the dealership. The admiration surrounding him seemed invisible to him. That alone impressed people even more. Victoria Sinclair stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching father and daughter from a distance. The confidence she carried into every business meeting felt strangely absent. For years she had believed success came from making fast decisions, quick evaluations, immediate conclusions. Yet standing there, she realized some of the most important truths required patience. She thought about Emma's face earlier that day when laughter had spread through the showroom. The memory stayed with her. More than the donation records, more than the stories, more than the business success. It was the expression of a little girl watching her father be judged unfairly. That memory refused to leave. Meanwhile, Emma sat on one of the showroom chairs, swinging her feet slightly above the polished floor. She looked toward her father. "Dad, yeah. Can I ask something?" Daniel smiled. "Always. When people are mean, how do you stay so calm?" Several employees nearby quietly listened. Daniel thought for a moment. "I was not always calm." Emma blinked. "Really? Really?" She smiled. "What changed?" Daniel looked through the showroom windows where evening sunlight reflected across parked vehicles. "I learned that other people's opinions usually tell you more about them than about yourself." Emma considered that carefully. "So you do not get angry?" Daniel laughed softly. "Of course I do." "Then what?" "Then I try to decide whether my anger will make anything better." The little girl smiled. Most of the time it does not." Several employees exchanged thoughtful glances. Victoria heard every word. The conversation felt simple, yet somehow it carried more wisdom than many leadership seminars she had attended. A few moments later, Emma looked across the showroom and noticed Victoria standing alone. Dad, yeah. Emma lowered her voice. I think she looks sad. Daniel followed her gaze. Victoria quickly looked away. Daniel smiled gently. Maybe she is having a hard day. Emma seemed surprised. After what she said, Daniel nodded. Everybody has hard days. The answer caught Victoria completely off guard. He had every reason to be resentful, every reason to criticize her. Instead, he offered understanding. Grace, the very thing she had failed to show him. Emma remained quiet for a moment. Then she said something so simple that it seemed to stop time. I hope she knows people can make mistakes and still be good people. Daniel smiled proudly. That is a very important thing to know. Victoria lowered her eyes immediately. The words landed harder than any criticism could have. Not because they accused her, because they forgave her before she had even asked. The realization stirred something deep inside her. For years, she had evaluated employees, customers, business partners, and opportunities through the lens of performance. Yet this little girl had just reminded her of something far more valuable. Humanity, second chances, compassion. Across the showroom, the final rays of sunlight illuminated the glass walls in shades of amber and gold. Customers gradually departed. Sales associates finished paperwork. Evening approached. Yet Victoria remained standing in the same spot. The laughter from earlier felt impossible to justify now. The assumptions felt embarrassing. The certainty she once felt had vanished completely. In its place came something much more honest. Regret. Not because Daniel turned out to be successful, not because he could afford the vehicle, but because she had failed to recognize dignity when it stood directly in front of her. And for the first time all day, Victoria Sinclair knew exactly what she needed to do next. The dealership had become remarkably quiet. Evening sunlight poured through the massive glass walls, painting the showroom in shades of gold and amber. The vehicles gleamed beneath the fading light, but very few people were looking at them anymore. Attention had shifted elsewhere, toward a father, toward a daughter, toward a lesson nobody expected to learn that afternoon. Daniel finished signing the last page of paperwork and handed the pen back to the sales consultant. That should do it. The consultant smiled warmly. Congratulations. Emma's eyes sparkled. Does that mean it is official? Daniel laughed softly. It means it is official. The little girl wrapped her arms around him. Several employees smiled at the sight. It was impossible not to. Joy has a way of changing a room. Yet across the showroom, Victoria Sinclair remained standing alone. She had spent the last 20 minutes gathering the courage to do something that once seemed easy. Walk up to another human being and admit she was wrong. Strange how difficult that could become when pride stood in the way. She took a slow breath and finally started walking. The polished floor reflected the movement of her heels as she crossed the showroom. Employees noticed immediately. A few customers did too. Nobody spoke. Daniel was helping Emma organize brochures when he noticed Victoria approaching. Emma saw her too. For a brief moment, the little girl's smile faded. Daniel gently rested a hand on her shoulder. It is okay. Victoria stopped a few feet away. The confidence that normally defined her seemed absent. For the first time all day, she looked uncertain. Human. Real. Mr. Brooks, she said quietly. Daniel smiled politely. Ms. Sinclair. A moment of silence followed. Victoria glanced toward Emma, then back at Daniel. I owe both of you an apology. The entire showroom seemed to hold its breath. Victoria lowered her eyes briefly. When you walked into this dealership today, I judged you without knowing anything about you. Daniel listened without interruption. I made assumptions. Her voice remained calm but sincere. And I treated you unfairly because of those assumptions. Emma looked up at her father. Daniel simply nodded. Victoria continued. The truth is, I should have known better. I spend a great deal of my life talking about leadership, respect, and values. She gave a small, self-conscious smile. Today I failed to practice any of them. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The apology belonged entirely to her. Victoria turned toward Emma. And I am especially sorry for the example I set in front of you. Emma studied her carefully. Children often possess a remarkable ability to recognize sincerity. Thank you, she said softly. Relief appeared in Victoria's eyes. Then she looked back at Daniel. I cannot change what I said, but I wanted you to know that I regret it. Daniel smiled gently. Not a triumphant smile. Not a victorious smile. Simply a kind one. Thank you for saying that. Victoria blinked. That is all. Daniel laughed softly. What else would there be? She looked genuinely surprised. You are not angry. Daniel thought for a moment. Being angry would not improve anybody's day. A few people smiled. Victoria shook her head slightly. You make that sound easy. It is not. Daniel looked toward Emma. But it is usually worth trying. The answer carried no judgment. No attempt to embarrass her. No desire to make her feel small. And somehow that made the moment even more powerful. Victoria felt a weight lift from her shoulders. Not because she had been forgiven. Because she had been shown grace she did not expect. Emma suddenly stepped forward. Can I say something? Victoria smiled. Of course. The little girl hesitated for a second. My dad says people are more important than mistakes. Silence followed. Gentle silence. The kind that settles over a room when something simple reveals something true. Victoria's eyes grew slightly emotional. Your dad sounds very wise. Emma smiled proudly. I think so too. Several employees quietly laughed. Daniel looked embarrassed by the attention. The sight made everyone smile even more. Outside, the sun drifted lower toward the horizon. Inside, something important had happened. No arguments. No revenge. No public humiliation. Just accountability met by grace. Respect restored through honesty. And as Victoria stood there looking at the father and daughter she had misjudged only hours earlier, she realized that success could buy many things in life. But the quiet dignity standing in front of her was something far more valuable. The sun was setting by the time Daniel and Emma walked toward the dealership entrance. The glass walls glowed with warm orange light, and long shadows stretched across the showroom floor. Employees who had been preparing to leave paused to watch them pass. Some offered smiles. Others nodded respectfully. A few quietly wished them well. The atmosphere felt completely different from the one that greeted them earlier that afternoon. Emma held a folder containing their paperwork and vehicle information as though it were treasure. Every few steps, she glanced through the windows toward their new SUV waiting outside. Her excitement seemed endless. Daniel smiled each time he noticed it. Moments like this mattered more than he could ever explain. Not because of the vehicle, because of what it represented. Years of hard work. Years of sacrifice. Years of keeping promises after life became far more difficult than he ever expected. Near the entrance, Victoria Sinclair stood waiting. Not as a CEO, not as the owner of a successful company, simply as a person who wanted to say goodbye properly. Mr. Brooks. Daniel stopped and smiled. Victoria. The fact that he used her first name made her smile slightly. It felt less formal, more human. Emma stood beside her father, still holding the folder. Victoria looked at the little girl. Are you excited? Emma laughed. Very. Good. Victoria glanced toward the vehicle outside. I think a lot of memories are going to happen in that SUV. Emma nodded enthusiastically. Road trips. Daniel smiled. Apparently many road trips. For a moment, all three stood quietly watching the sunset paint the parking lot in gold. Then Victoria looked toward Daniel. You taught me something today. Daniel appeared surprised. I did. You did. She smiled softly. Actually, both of you did. Emma looked confused. Victoria laughed gently. You reminded me that success is not the same thing as character. The little girl thought about that. Then she nodded. Dad says character takes longer to see. Victoria smiled. Your dad is right. Daniel looked slightly embarrassed again. Emma grinned. He does that a lot. Several nearby employees laughed. The sound felt warm and genuine. No tension remained. No awkwardness. Just people sharing a quiet moment of understanding. Victoria extended her hand. Daniel shook it. Thank you for your grace, she said. Daniel shook his head slightly. We all have moments we would like to do differently. Victoria smiled. That may be the most generous answer I have ever heard. Then she looked at Emma one final time. Take care of your dad. Emma smiled proudly. I always do. Outside, the evening air felt cool and peaceful. Daniel opened the passenger door, and Emma climbed inside immediately. Her excitement had not faded for a second. Before closing the door, she looked back through the dealership windows. Victoria was still standing there. The little girl waved. Victoria waved back. Then Daniel walked around to the driver's side. Before getting in, he paused for a moment and looked toward the dealership. Earlier that day, he had entered as a stranger. He had been judged, dismissed, laughed at, yet he was leaving without bitterness, without resentment, without any desire to prove a point. Because some victories are not about proving people wrong. Some victories are about refusing to let other people's mistakes change who you are. He climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The dashboard illuminated softly. Emma smiled. Ready? Daniel looked at his daughter. Ready. Slowly, they pulled out of the dealership parking lot and disappeared into the golden light of evening. Through the showroom windows, Victoria watched them go. Not with regret anymore. With gratitude. Because sometimes life sends a lesson when you least expect it. A lesson wrapped in work boots, quiet dignity, and the wisdom of a little girl. That evening, a father left with a vehicle he had earned. A daughter left with a memory she would never forget. And a CEO left with something even more valuable than either of those things. Perspective. The dealership would open again tomorrow. Business would continue. Cars would be sold. Meetings would be held. But one truth would remain. The most remarkable people are often the ones who never feel the need to announce their worth. They simply live it. Quietly. Consistently. Gracefully. And if this story reminded you of someone whose character spoke louder than their circumstances, perhaps share that memory below. And if stories about dignity, second chances, and the quiet strength of ordinary people still matter to you, we would be honored to have you join us again for the next one.